if we look at the passages about Allah within the Quran are only about 14% statistically of the total content. The remaining 86% of the Quran is about Muhammad. So Allah only makes up 14% of the book itself. So the bulk of it is really just about Muhammad. But then oddly, Muhammad's only mentioned 4 times in the Quran, and Jesus is mentioned 15 times.
Isn't it 24 times?
It may be, but so I mean, my aim is not to get into the theology. But this is simply just food for thought, things to think about. Okay, now a Muslim is to follow the example of Muhammad, who is the ideal pattern of conduct, the ideal Muslim, the perfect man. So, and this is stated in the Quran 91 times. Okay, so these commands take 2 forms: historical examples and direct commands to follow Muhammad as the ideal moral example for all Muslims to follow. If Muhammad does something, it is both legal and moral within Islam. Oh, my window just blew up and it's snowing outside.
Oh.
So now another thing for people to know is that the Quran has what's called an early period and a late period. Okay, these are often referred to as the Meccan Quran and the Medinan Quran. And these two have wildly contradictory verses. So Muslims will often, and they know these, and they honestly believe it, that this is all there is, and they often weren't told by the imams that there's more to it, but they get given these good verses, these happy verses.
It's called abrogation. Is that what we're getting into?
But now we have what's called nasik wal mansuk. Okay, the abrogating and the abrogated. This again is covered within the Sharia. Right, now remember, the Sharia is law for eternity, for all time. It can never be changed. So it is very easy to find deeply contradictory verses within the Quran. And the law of abrogation, or the principle of abrogation of the doctrine, tells us that a chronologically later verse is theologically better than an older one. So what is newer erases, cancels, replaces older verses. Right? So remember, the confusion also stems that the Quran is not arranged chronologically. It is arranged by length of chapter. The first chapter is a very short chapter called the Fatiha, the opening, and then you have the longest to the shortest, right? Now, within Islam, both of these contradictory verses will stand as true, right? The Western concept of logic, where one cancels the other, does not apply. The disqualification does not apply.
Now, right. One thing that I do find interesting is that, on page 1, line 6, show us the straight way, the way of those whom thou bestow thy grace, whose portion is not wrath, and who go not astray. Now, that sounds, the straight way sounds that they are talking about the way of truth over all else, but is there a different meaning to that?
So it depends on the translation you look at. So that is, if you go to the Muhsin Khan Quran, okay, that's Quran 167. Right?
Correct.
That is called the Fatiha, the opening prayer of the Quran. And I'll read this. It says, guide us to the straight way, the way of those on whom you've bestowed your grace, not the way of those who've earned your anger, such as the Jews, nor of those who went astray, such as the Christians. That is the actual text of the Muhsin Khan version.
And then there's other texts that say that the Jews and Christians are okay, but then there's later texts that abrogate or that refute that, correct?
Muhammad wanted to be regarded as a prophet in the Abrahamic line, and he was not accepted by either the Jews or the Christians. Remember, in the first 18 months of Islam, he used to pray towards Jerusalem. And then when the Jews refused to accept him as a prophet, he rejected them. He hated them. He turned violent on them. And he then started praying towards Mecca. Right, so to continue with this idea of abrogation, so nasik wal mansuk, the abrogating and the abrogated. So both verses stand. So it depends, where are we within Islam? Where am I currently? So depending on the condition or the need, I can present one verse, and depending if I'm in a different situation, I follow the other verse. So both of these are true, and they're both utilized as appropriate, as long as it benefits the Muslim or Islam. Right? So Islam is it's got a dualism, it's got a duality to it that most of us don't understand, that we don't realize is there. We assume we see it with Western eyes. We don't see it from the perspective of the culture within Islam. And for instance, in Quran 2:106, we've got, and for whatever verse we abrogate or cast into oblivion, we bring a better or the like of it. Knowest thou not that God is powerful, or Allah is powerful over everything? And when we substitute a verse, Quran 16:101, and when we substitute a verse in place of a verse, they say, you, O Muhammad, and people were doubting this, are but an inventor of lies, but most of them do not know. So there was already doubt as to how the message was changing over time. This is regarded theologically as Islam is revealed over time, depending on where you are. So following Muhammad's example, there's 91 verses that say, follow the example of Muhammad. In this situation, he did this. In that situation, he did something else. Well, so we can, there's no consistency there. There's no single absolute rule of behavior.
Okay, now somebody is saying you are mixing truth with falsehood. What do you have to say to that?
I am simply quoting straight out of the Islamic books. These are the most authoritative books. I mean, you can go to Quranics.com. You can check everything I've said. Quran 16, 101, Quran 2, 106, and you can download a copy of the Sharia and you can absolutely read that for yourself. It's discussed within the Sharia as well. If I go to my notes on abrogation, let's have a look. So I didn't write this. I'm simply reading it. Okay.
And why don't you show this on screen? And this guy, Lars Bendixson, is saying, check out Saeed Lippman.
I don't know who that is. So you can go to various Islamic websites. Now, if we go to islamreview.com, which talks about the doctrine of abrogation. Now, I don't own this website. I didn't write the articles on this website. It's, again, one of the bigger, best known, most common articles on the subject. Now, is this Muslim a racist and Islamophobe for writing this? I'm simply quoting what they're saying. Now, you can look at the verse in which, three kinds of abrogation, verses in which both the wording and application were abrogated. I'll skip on that. Let's look at the reliance, O22.1. To become a qadi, or an Islamic judge, you have to know those nasik which supersede previously revealed Quranic verses. An Islamic judge has to know which verses have been abrogated and those mansuk. So the nasik, the abrogating, and the mansuk, the abrogated. So it is a necessity to become an Islamic judge to be able to tell which is which. Okay? And then it also says here, explain the Quran by personal opinion. Okay? Whoever speaks of the book of Allah from his own opinion is in error. So if you want, and the generality of prohibition also entails that whoever does not know which verses abrogate others and which are abrogated, that is in the Sharia. That is the ultimate law of Allah. This is the abrogation is irrevocable. It's for all time.